Hi, today we're going to be talking about the static variable and static method. And I'm using early Big Java early objects book. And this is in chapter 8 for classes. So we have talked about the classes. And when we're creating a class, we will have some private variables, and we're going to have some let me put this one away. Okay, so we're going to have some private variables and we're going to have some public methods in general. So that means that if we have private variables, these private variables belong to an object. That means if I created 10 objects of this class, each one of them have their own balance and account number in this case. And when the methods going to be called, they usually are public, so anybody can call those methods, and those methods are going to be accessing the private variables, instance variable. Now, there is something called a static variable. So in here, we are defining something called last assigned number, that's 1000, and is a static int. This means that if I create 10 objects of this class, I will have only one of these variables. So if I created 10 objects, I would have 10 different private double balance, 10 different account number, but I only going to have one last assigned number, meaning that all these objects are going to be sharing that together. Some of you want to think about it as a global variable or something like that. We are talking about it that it belongs to the class, not the object. That means if you create 100 objects or you create 2 objects, you're only going to have one of these. So we're going to go over how we're going to do this. And I ask you guys to do this in the what you're going to do this week. So it's going to be 1000. And in here, we are adding one to it and we're going to use it. So the next object is going to have this one as 1001. So what I want you to pay attention here is when I am adding last assigned number plus plus in any of the objects, of course, I'm using a constructor, but the problem with the static variable is that any object can change that variable at any time. That's something that we have to keep eye on it, because in general, those static variables can be changed from any object at any time. That's something we have to be careful. So that's what we're doing, and we're going to go get more into it to learn what are these the static variable and possibly a static method. So let's get in there. So if I create 3 object of bank account, whatever it is, I am sharing one of these. So I'm going to create more and more objects. So I can have more than 3, I can have 100, I can have thousands of bank account objects, but I am going to have only one last assigned number. That's just a static. Let's take this one and look at it from different point of view. I'm looking at a townhouse, condominium. You guys are going to be making good money after you graduate, so you go and buy a townhouse in an area. So, and these townhouses are going to be sharing some things. So you're going to own one of these townhouses, then you share pool with everybody else, you share gym with everybody else. So in this townhouse, condominium area, apartments, whatever you want to call it, they are sharing pool. The good thing about it is they don't have 50 pools in there. They only have one. So the maintenance is easy, and they can clean it, they can maintain it. But on the other side of it is because it's used by all the townhouses, if somebody does something wrong to the pool, it's going to affect everybody else. So one owner come in and does something wrong in the pool, I'm not going to say what, then everybody else is going to suffer from it. So that's the downside. And the good side is, when they want to maintain, they don't have to maintain 50 pools, they're just going to maintain one. Same thing goes with the gym. They go and buy some equipment, they put it in a gym, everybody's going to be using it. And now if a machine breaks, everybody's going to suffer, or something happened to the machine, then everybody's going to suffer. If we have too many people in the gym, then the other people cannot use it. So any object can affect my static area that's going to be shared with everybody else. Moving on, so we're talking about how do we do this, and so every object, when we create the object, when we use the new and we create the object, instantiate an object from a class, they're going to have their own, in this case, balance and account number. So each class is going to have its own balance, it's going to have its own account number. We are defining them as private, meaning that no other object can directly access this balance and account number. But there are some methods that's going to be applied to this object. So when I want to execute bank account, I have to say which object do I want to apply that method. Well, of course, that's a constructor, but let's say that I want to get balance, or I want to do something with the get account number. So that get account number, if it's inside of here, it's going to give me this account number. If it's inside of here, it's going to give me this account number. So they are different. Now, if I have get last assigned number, in any of them, it's going to give me exactly the same thing. So, and that would be a static method, get assigned number. We're going to get to that. So the bottom line is we would have one static variable, instance variable, and then we have other ones. So it is stored in this separate location. It is not part of the object. So static variable should be private. What does that mean? That even though the objects have access to it and the object can modify it, we don't want other objects, other places come in and access this one. So we want to control it inside our own object. So no other object can or should be able to modify our private static variable. So let's go and apply that to some other things. Before we do that, we want to talk about the static constants. So that what we talked about right now was the static variable. Now we're going to talk about static constant. Static constants are the one that is potentially can be used with outside objects, other objects. So they can be private or public. So generally, we're going to put them as a public. So in this case, we have a bank account that has our draft fee. So we can set it in one of these places. And now any other object can directly access this if I put it as a public. So if I set this as a public, so other objects can access this one. They don't need to be, remember, if I put it private, only the objects has been created from this class have the access to it, no other ones. But if I put it as a public, other objects can use it. So in the financial record, we want to know what is the overdraft fee, and then we just come in and access it. So let's go over our example that we are talking about. We're talking about townhomes, we're talking about apartments, condominiums, that we have these objects that they are sharing some stuff together. Now, to make this a little easier to understand, we're going to be looking at some properties that we have for these condominiums, and then we're going to decide if it's going to be public or private. So first one is a gym. So is the gym a private or a public? So let's think about it. What we said is if it's private, that means the objects that we have of this class, condominium, apartment, or townhomes, they have access to it. But outsiders don't have access to it. Do we want to make our gym as a public that anybody in the city can come to our gym? Of course, we don't want to do that. So we're going to make that as a private. Next one is a pool. So again, the pool is supposed to be accessed by the tenants. Of course, there are some people that are going to bring somebody from outside and they're not enforced, but the idea is what? The pool is for tenants only. Nobody from outside can come and access the pool. Same thing goes with the laundry room. If you have a laundry room in the apartment building, that is going to be private. The people from outside should not have access to it. Now, let's talk about some public rooms. So if I live in a townhouse or apartment building or some places, the management office, is the management office or their phone number or the office itself, is it accessible from the people outside of the apartment? Yes, that is why is it public. The number of units. So if I set the number of units for this building, let's say it's 50, 23, whatever it is, that can be potentially public. Anybody can use that number from outside. They don't have to be only the tenants that can access that apartment number. The street address, same concept. Building county records. So if I go to the county and I pull the record of any building, that's a public record, so I can have access to it. Everybody has access to the building's record. So that is public, everybody have access to it. So kind of a example to kind of visualize what the public is, what the private is. The private is only the insiders can have access to it. Public, anybody in the world can have access to it. Moving on, so if I have a bank account and I have balance and account number, if I have different objects, in this case, college fund, mom saving, Harris checking, or any people in there, then they have different balance, different account. Those are private. Nobody can access them directly. The only way they can access it is through some methods that we can provide. But this account last assigned number, that is static, but it is going to be private static. That means these objects have access to this, but outsiders don't have access to it. 1. 2, any of this object can change this static value. So because if you remember in this one, in our constructor, we are adding 1 to it and then we use it. So starting point is 1,000. We're going to use the 1,000. We're going to add 1,001, and then 1,002 and 1,003. So we add 1 and then use it. So when this first object is going to be created, my account number is going to be 1,001. The second one is going to be 1,002, and so on and so forth. So private has the objects have access to it. Other objects don't have access to it. all of the objects internally, whatever object was created from that class can modify that variable. That's the danger of these things. Okay, so sometimes we need to do some methods. Remember, if you define this as a public, you can have other objects to have access to it. One. Two, you do not need to create an object to use that variable. So if I have a public static variable, I don't need to create an object to use it. It belongs to the class. So I'm just going to access it through the class. So same thing goes with the method. So if I have a method that I want to define it as a static, I don't need to create an object. It does not belong to the object. It belongs to the class. So we can call that method, and generally it's doing something with my static variable. And that's what the static method is. So if I have 50 objects, every method that I want to execute, it has to know which object we're going to apply this method. Early on, we talked about the cars as a class. So if I want to paint a car, we have to know which object of the car we need to paint it. Or if we want to register a car or we want to sell a car, we have to have the object to be able to apply the method. But here, there is something that it is available to everybody. So if I want to check something, or if I want to do something that doesn't belong to the object, then we can use the static method. So something like this, in the math class, we have something called the square root. The square root function method does not belong to the object. So if I have an x as a number, then a square root does not belong to that. I cannot execute it like this. I have to call the class math.square root. So this square root is a static method, and the only way I can execute it is through the class, not the object. It doesn't belong to the object. And the good thing about it is I don't need to create an object to execute this one. My regular methods, if I don't have any object, I cannot execute my method. I have to create the object first before I be applying the method. So if I want to paint a car, I have to have an object of a car to be able to apply it. So we can create our own static method. So that would be something like this, that we can create. So this one is my regular method. This one is my static method. So that means this method does not belong to the object. So when I have a class and I create objects and objects and objects, this one does not belong to the object. So when I want to execute this method, I have to use the name of the class, not the name of the object. So I am calling the financial, which is the name of my class, and then percent of, which is the name of my method, and then I pass it and it's going to be used. So that's the way we can use this. So the main method is always a static, because we only want to have one main method. We don't want to have multiple mains. We just want to have one. Doesn't matter if you have 10 classes or 50 classes or so many, you're only going to have one main. So that's the static all the time. So we don't have any objects, so that's one of the reasons we are using the main. And the first method must be static. And the rule of thumb is we know about the statics we're going to be using whenever it's needed, but let's not go crazy about it. Let's not use too many of them. It has its drawback and it has its issues, but so my biggest problem with the static is that every object of its own, and later on we learn about the inheritance and all those things, can modify my variable. So if it's been changed, I don't know which object has changed. So if I have 50 objects and something has happened to my static variable, I don't know which object has changed because anybody can change that equally. So that's going to make our object-oriented design a little harder to debug or figure out what's going on. But in certain areas, just like what we talked about, we need it and we're going to be using it. Okay, so that's the end of this one. And you guys can start working with the last self-check that I posted in the activity for doing this, and bring your questions to our class for or the DQ, so we can talk about these things.